In this video, we'll be covering the 10.3 worksheet on parabolas. Number 1 states to graph the parabola in this form. The first thing we want to do is identify that our a is the number before our variable x here. Our a is positive, which means it's going to open either up or to the right. If you notice on our equations here, we have a y squared, so we'll be using a horizontal axis of symmetry. This means that we will be opening up right. Our vertex in this case is 0, 0, because you can see that there's no numbers attached to our x or our y here. Once you have your vertex, you're going to go ahead and draw a table. I always label the vertex right in the middle, which is 0, 0. Because we're opening up right, our x value will have 2 y's. Remember that this is not a function because one x has 2 different y's. So I chose strategically x's that were going to get me whole numbers for my y values. So I chose a 4 for x because I see that 1/4 times 4 will get me a positive 1. But remember, when we're solving for y and I take the square root of both sides, I also get -1. Once you have these points here, I just went ahead and labeled and then drew my parabola. Number 2. Number 2 says to graph the parabola in this form. First thing we want to do is determine which form we have. Since we have the x listed first, it means that we're following this form. So the a is going to be equal to -3. I went ahead and put our a is negative. Remember, when your a is negative, it's either going to open up left or it's going to open up down. Because the x is in the first part, our graph opens up to the left. Our k in this case is going to be a -2. Now be careful here because remember, this is our x, this is our y. When the number is attached to the y, we want to make sure to put this -2 in the y slot, not in the x slot. Then it says plus h. Because we're looking for a positive sign here, we're going to leave h is equal to 5. The next thing I'm going to do is go ahead and create a table. I always indicate the vertex in the middle. Once I did that, I went ahead and graphed that one point. I strategically looked for values of x so that way I get a really nice whole number for my y. If you plug in a 2 here, you can work backwards. I'm going to go ahead and show you how I work backwards in this case. If I let my x equal to 2, I can equal that to -3 y plus 2 squared plus 5. Subtract the 5 from both sides and I get -3 is equal to -3 y plus 2 squared. Remember, in this case we want to divide by the -3 before we take the square roots. When I do that, I get a positive 1 is equal to y plus 2 squared. At this point, we can take the square root of both sides, but remember, when you take the square root, the side that is not squared will have the plus or minus. The square and the square root will cancel out. So now I'm left with plus or minus 1 is equal to y plus 2. Next thing I'm going to do is go ahead and subtract 2 from both sides. You're going to get y is equal to -2 plus or minus 1. I would break up this and have y is equal to -2 plus 1, or y can equal to -2 minus 1. Over here, y would be equal to -1, or y could be equal to -3. If x is equal to 2, which is what I plugged in originally here, my y could be a -3 or my y could be a -1. I did the same thing for plugging in an x that is equal to -7. I went ahead and plotted those points, and then I'm able to go ahead and graph the parabola. Number 3. Number 3 says to write the equation of the parabola given the vertex and the focus. So the first thing I did was went ahead and graphed it on the side here. I labeled the vertex -5, +1, so here's the vertex. Our directrix is x equals 0. Remember that this is a vertical line, and I went ahead and indicated in a dashed line. Notice that my dashed line is here, but it's hard to see because it is on the y-axis. The distance between the directrix and the vertex is going to be our p. If you forget this, go back to our set of equations, which is located here. If you notice the directrix, here's our k value and here's our h value. And then you subtract your p. So the distance between the directrix and the vertex is p. So here I have p is equal to 5. The next thing I did was notice that it's opening up in the left direction. Remember, when it opens up left, our p is going to be a negative. So here we can say p is equal to -5. We want to determine which set of equations to use, so we will look at our axis of symmetry. Since our axis of symmetry is horizontal, in other words, it's going across the horizon, we're going to be using the format like this. So I started with my y minus k, square it, is equal to 4p x minus h. The next thing I did was go ahead and fill in our values. Since we're given our vertex, we know h is equal to -5 and k is equal to 1. So y minus k, which is 1, square that, is equal to 4. Bring the 4 down, and p is going to be equal to -5 times x minus h. Since h here is negative, we have a negative times a negative, which gets me a +5. Don't forget to go ahead and multiply your 4p. So here my final equation will read y minus 1 in parentheses squared is equal to -20 times, in parentheses, x plus 5. Number 4 says to write the equation of the parabola given this graph. So on our graph, we're given our vertex, and we're also given another point on the graph. The first thing we want to do is determine the orientation of the axis of symmetry. Since the axis of symmetry is going to be along this line, we can say the axis of symmetry is going to be horizontal. So when I look at my set of equations, I will be using this format here. Now I'm going to go ahead and label my h and my k. My h is going to be a -2 and my k will be a 4. So I'm going to go ahead and use the general form for a horizontal axis of symmetry. Y minus k squared is equal to 4p x minus h. I'm going to plug in my values for h and k, which is -2 and 4. So y minus k, which is 4, so I have y minus 4 squared, is equal to 4p times x plus 2. Remember that this 2 is negative, and a negative times a negative will get me a positive. Then I'm going to use the second point that was given, which is -5, 2. Use these 2 points as our x here and as our y here. So I used a y value of -2 minus 4 squared is equal to 4p times -5, because that's our x given, plus 2, which is this part here. Remember, in this part, what we're trying to do is solve for p. So -2 minus 4 is -6. When we square that, we get a 36. Over here, we have a -5 plus 2, which is equal to a -3, and then we have to multiply that by 4, so we get a -12, and then bring down the p. Here, divide both sides by -12, and you get p is equal to -3. This p with a negative value makes sense since our graph is opening up to the left. Once you have your p, use the second equation and just substitute the p that we solved for. So y minus 4 in parentheses, square that, is equal to negative 3 times 4 is negative 12, and then x plus 2. This is all you need to solve this problem. Number 5 is a word problem involving a parabola. It says a satellite dish has the shape of a parabola when viewed from the side. The receiver, which is at the focus, is 8 inches from the bottom, and you can see that it's labeled here. And the dish is 18 inches deep. That means from this point here all the way down is going to be 18 inches. What we're trying to solve for is the width of the dish. So the first thing we want to do is go ahead and label our vertex. We're going to use the vertex of 0, 0. The next thing I want to do is notice that the axis of symmetry is going to be in a vertical direction. So this time we'll be using this set of equations here. In order to solve for P, we know that our P is from our focus down to the vertex. If you forget this, remember that the vertex in this case is H and K, and the focus is going to be H and K, and the difference is going to be P. So here, if I know that the distance is 8, I can say that P is equal to 8. Since it's opening in an up direction, I know that this is going to be a positive 8. So I'm going to use the general terms of my equations, which is listed here. I just rewrote it. And then I use my vertex of H being 0 and K being 0. I also plugged in the 8 for P. So here I have x squared is equal to 4 times 8 times y. X squared is equal to 32y. Now I have a point out here to the side which I need to solve for. I don't know what A is, but I know that our B in this case is going to be 18. So I'm just substituting the point. A is going to be our x and the y will be our 18. So a squared is equal to 32 times 18. When I put this in the calculator, I get a squared is equal to 576, and then I take the square root of that. So a is going to be 24. Remember, the distance of A is going to be from the center off to one side and from the center off to the other side. So I can say that the width of the dish is going to be 48 inches. 24 this direction and 24 in this direction. A total distance of 48. Number 6 says to find the vertex, the focus, the directrix, and the axis of symmetry of the parabola. Here we're given our equation. So let's first determine which set of equations we're going to be using. Notice that the y is first, so we're going to use a horizontal axis of symmetry. So I'm going to go ahead and cover up my other set of equations. Now what I'm going to do is go ahead and list my h and my k. Since my h is attached to the x, I want to make sure to list my vertex at -1 first. Remember that there's a negative sign here, so I have to factor a negative sign here. So our vertex is going to be -1, comma, our k is going to be attached to the y, which in this case is just 3. Once I have this information, I'm going to go ahead and solve for p. Notice that there's no p here, so I can assume that 4p is equal to this -7. So 4p is equal to -7, and then I can divide on both sides by 4. So p here is going to be equal to -7/4. The negative tells me it's going to open up to the left because my axis of symmetry is horizontal. It will open up to the left and not down. The next thing I'm going to do is go ahead and solve for our focus, which is this equation here. Notice it says h plus p, comma, k. Our h is a -1, which can be found right here, plus p. But since p is -7/4, I'm going to go ahead and subtract 7/4, comma, our k, which is 3. When I add these two in the calculator, I can simplify my fraction to be a -11/4. Comma 3. To solve for the directrix, we're going to go ahead and use this equation here. All I did here was rewrite the equations, and then I filled in my values for h and p. h is still going to be -1, and my p is going to be 7/4. Notice that there's a negative sign in the equation, so a negative times a negative will get me a positive. When I add these two together, I get x is equal to 3/4. It is important here that you include the variable, because you could have here y is equal to 3/4 instead of x is equal to 3/4. If you do not include the variable and just write the number on the exam, this equation will be incorrect. Even though it is the correct number here, you still need to indicate if it's going to be a vertical line or if it's going to be a horizontal line. Our axis of symmetry is this equation here, which is simply a y is equal to whatever our k value is. So our axis of symmetry is y is equal to, our k in this case is 3, so y is equal to 3. You will always have the directrix be one variable and your axis of symmetry be the other. You will never see both of these be y, and you will never see both of these be x. So if you have both of them y or both of them x, you have to realize that you've made a mistake somewhere. Number 7. Number 7 says to write an equation of the parabola given the focus and the directrix. So in this case here we have our focus, which I went ahead and drew on the graph here. So here is my 0, 0. I went back 9 and up 3. I know the directrix is x equals 7, which means that this is going to be a vertical line. The distance between the focus and the directrix is going to be a distance of 16. If this is in the center 0 and I'm going back 9 and then I'm going forward 7, that means I'm just adding 9 plus 7, which is 16. So if I know the distance between the foci and the directrix is 16, I need to discover what P is. Remember that this is not drawn to scale. So when I'm looking at my set of equations, I'm going to go ahead and determine that my axis of symmetry in this case is going to be a horizontal axis. If you go down here to our directrix, you will see that the distance between our vertex and our directrix is P. Our distance between the focus and the vertex is also P. So the distance between the focus and the vertex is going to be exactly the same distance as the vertex to the directrix. This is not to scale. So if the total distance is 16, that means the distance to the vertex is going to be half that, which is 8. So P is going to be equal to 8. The other thing you need to notice in this case is that it opens up in the left direction. The left direction indicates that it has to be a negative. So here we can say P is equal to -8. So if I'm solving for my vertex, the first thing I'm going to do is say -k plus the distance P, which is 8, and I'm going to stay at the same y, which is 3. So -9 plus 8 is -1, and 3 is going to be my y. This is where my vertex is actually going to be located. Now that I know that this is h and this is k, I can go ahead and write it in this form. Y minus k, which in this case is 3, and you need to square it, is equal to 4 times p. We said that p is equal to -8, so 4 times -8 is going to be -32. X minus h. Since our h is -1, we have a -1 times a negative, which gets me a +1. This will be the formula that we're looking for. Number 8. Number 8 says to find the focus of the parabola in the form stated like this or like this. As you notice that this is not a standard form for a parabola. What we want to do is go ahead and complete our squares. I went ahead and made our y squared positive by switching it over to the other side. So our y squared minus 4y, again I took the 4y over to the other side, which made it -4y, plus some number, and I left the 5x plus 16 on this side. Since I'm adding another number on this side of the equation, I need to also add a blank on this side of the equation. In order to complete the squares, we're always going to complete the squares that has the square on it. I take the middle term, which is -4, and I divide it by 2. That gets me a -2, and when I square it, I get a 4. This 4 goes in both of these blanks. Then I'm able to factor it out by looking for my variable on this side, which is y, and I put it in front of the -2. So y minus 2 in parentheses and square it is equal to 5x. 16 plus 4 is equal to 20. The next thing I'm going to go ahead and do here is factor out a 5 because a 5 is in common with both the 5 and the 20. So I just brought the y minus 2 squared down, and then I factor out the 5. In parentheses, I have an x plus 4. So I can see my vertex is going to be a -4. Remember here the equation calls for a negative, but since this is positive, I'm taking the opposite, which is a -4. And over here, there's already a negative, so I'm just taking the 2. So our vertex here is going to be -4, 2. In order to solve for our p, remember we'll be using this number here. So 4p is equal to 5. Divide by 4, you get p is equal to 5 over 4. Because our p is positive, we're going to be opening up to the right. So let's solve for our focus. We're going to use our set of equations, which is given here, and we're going to go ahead and use h, which is -4, plus p, which is 5 over 4, comma k, which in this case is 2. Use the calculator to simplify this to -11 over 4, comma 2. In this particular problem, we're just solving for the focus, so that's all we did here. Number 9. Number 9 says we're going to classify the conic section given the equation. Part A, I went ahead and combined like terms. 4x squared minus x plus some number, remember we have to complete the squares, plus 4y squared minus 24y, again plus some number. I took this 24 over to the other side, which means it's equal to a -24 plus 2 numbers. Since I have 2 blanks on this side, I need 2 blanks on this side. The first thing you want to do is go ahead and factor out this 4. So I have 4 in parentheses, x squared minus 2, because remember 4 times -2 is -8x. In order to complete the squares here, I took this middle term of -2, divided it by 2, which gave me a -1. I squared that, which gave me a +1, but remember, even though the +1 went in this blank, I'm multiplying that by 4, so I'm going to have to be adding 4 to this side. For this second one, I went ahead and factor out a 4 as well, so I had a +4, parentheses, y squared minus 6y, because 4 times -6 is -24, plus some number. I took the middle term, which is -6, divided it by 2, which gave me a -3. When you square it, you get a +9, which goes in this blank. However, you're not just adding 9, you're adding 9 times 4. So I have to add 36 to this other blank. The next thing I'm going to do is go ahead and factor. I brought down the 4 directly, and then I used this part of the equation and just completed it by putting in the variable x. So x minus 1, all of that squared, plus 4, just brought the 4 down, and then I used the variable y in front of this -3 here. So 4 times y minus 3, and you square it. All of that, use the calculator to add this together, and you should have gotten 16. Now, this is an important part. If you notice here, you have a 4 and you have a 4 here, you want to go ahead and divide everything by 4. If we divided by 16, yes, we would have a 1, but we would have a denominator that was the same for both. When the denominator is the same for both, if you think about it, it means that we have a circle. So divide by 4, and we get x minus 1 squared plus y minus 3 squared is equal to 4. So if you see here, r squared is equal to 4. So here our radius is going to be equal to 2. So this is going to be our circle, and it's going to be centered at 1, 3. Here's our H, and here's our K. Part B. Part B, we're going to go ahead and complete the squares again, and I'm going to go ahead and combine my x terms first. So x squared plus 6x plus some number. Plus here I have a 4y squared plus 16y plus some number. Take the 21 over to the other side, which gives us a negative 21, plus two numbers since I have two blanks. The first thing I'm going to do is complete the squares for this first part. I take the middle term, which is a positive 6, and divide that by 2. That gets me a positive 3. When I square it, I get 9, which goes in this first blank. Because there's no number that I factored out, I can go ahead and put a 9 on the other side of the equation as well. Then I went ahead and used this by just plugging in the variable in the first part, which was x. So here I have x plus 3, and I square it. Plus, I'm going to use the second part by factoring out a 4. So I have 4 here, and in parentheses I have y squared plus 4y. Remember, 4 times 4 is equal to 16. Plus some number. I'm going to add that number to the other side as well. The thing that I did here was go ahead and add the negative 21 plus 9, which gave me a negative 12. Plus this one blank on both sides. I'm going to go ahead and complete the squares for the second part. I took the middle term, which was 4, divided that by 2, which gave me a positive 2. When I square it, I get 4. The 4 goes on this part here, but remember I have 4 times 4, so I have to add 16 to the other side of the equation. Then I went ahead and used this part of the equation, and I plugged in the variable y in front of that plus 2. I brought the x plus 3 squared down, plus 4, and then I factored this out to be y plus 2 squared. All of that is equal to 4 because I add those two together. Notice here you have different coefficients before the x and before the y, so I'm going to go ahead and set this equation equal to 1. I divide each side by 4, which gets me 1/4 x plus 3 squared, plus 4 divided by 4 is just 1, but I still went ahead and wrote it like this. Y plus 2 and square that is all equal to 1. The reason I know that this is an ellipse is because you can see here you have a plus sign between these two terms. If I notice here, I have plus sign between these two terms. Here's a negative sign, and then here I have one of the terms being squared while the other one is not. So this is going to be similar to this type of equation here, which means it's an ellipse. So I labeled part B as an ellipse, and the center is going to be at -3, -2. Remember, on our ellipse equations, we want to have built-in negatives. Since these are positive here and here, I have to take the opposite sign. So -3, -2. For part C, the first thing I'm going to do is go ahead and combine my like terms. I have 3y squared minus 18y. Since x is not squared, I'm going to take it to the other side, which made it a positive x, and take the 29 over to the other side, which made that a negative 29. Then I'm going to go ahead and complete the squares on this side, which means that I have to factor out the 3. So the 3 comes on the outside, and inside the parentheses is going to be y squared minus 6. 3 times -6 is -18y. In order to complete the squares, I take this middle term of -6 and I divide that by 2. -6 divided by 2 gets me a -3, and once I square that, I get a 9. That 9 goes in this blank here. Remember, we cannot add a 9 to the other side because I'm doing technically 9 times 3. 9 times 3 is 27, so I can add that to the other side of the equation. The next thing I do is just bring down the 3, and then I'm going to use this part of the problem to help me factor. I'm using the variable y, since y is in this side of the equation, in front of the -3. So y minus 3, all of that squared, is going to be equal to x comes down, negative 29 plus 27 gets me a negative 2. So now that I have it in this form, I want to take this 3 over to the other side, so I divide it by 3. So y minus 3 squared is equal to 1/3, and then keep this in parentheses as x minus 2. If you notice here, one of these variables is squared while the other is not, which looks similar to these equations here. So this is going to be a parabola with the vertex of h and k. So if you notice on our equations here, our vertex is going to be h, which is associated with our x term. The negative has to stay, so here my vertex is going to be 2, and my k is going to be just the 3, because the negative is part of the equation. Part D. Part D has this formula, and again I'm going to combine my like terms. I'm going to start with the positive y squared since we want our positive numbers to be first. So 16y squared minus 32y plus some number. And then I have my negative x squared minus 4x plus some number. I took this 4 to the other side, which made it positive, and then I have 2 blanks on this side, so I'm going to add 2 blanks on this side. To complete the squares on the first part, we want to factor out a 16. So 16 times y squared minus 2, because 16 times negative 2 is 32, y plus some number. I'm going to take the middle term of negative 2 and divide that by 2, which gave me a negative 1. Square it, and I get a positive 1. That positive 1 goes in this first blank. But remember, because we factor out a 16, I have to do 1 times 16 and put a positive 16 on the other side of the equation. On the second part of completing the squares, we're going to go ahead and factor out this negative. So I have a negative 1 on the outside, and in the inside I'm going to have an x squared plus 4, because a negative times a positive equals a negative x, plus some number. I take the middle coefficient, which is positive 4, and I divide that by 2. That gets me a positive 2, which I then square, which gets me a 4. That 4 goes in this blank. But remember, we're doing 4 times negative 1, so I have to add a negative 4 to the other side of the equation. Now I can go ahead and simplify. I brought down the 16. I used the variable y, and I put it in front of the negative 1 here. So I have y minus 1, and I square that entire thing. Minus, and then I use the variable x, and I put it in front of the plus 2 here. So x plus 2 and all of that squared is going to be equal to, the 4's will cancel since I have 1 positive and 1 negative, leaving me with just the 16, which I have here. Since I don't have the same coefficients for my x and for my y, I'm going to go ahead and set this equation equal to 1 by dividing everything by 16. So 16 divided by 16 is just 1, y minus 1 squared. Bring the negative down, and then here it will be x plus 2 squared divided by 16. All of that is equal to 1, since 16 divided by 16 is 1. When I look at this equation here, I can see that there's a negative sign, and there's only one set of equations that have a negative, and that's going to be for the hyperbola. So here we have an hyperbola equation. Remember, our center is going to be our h and our k, and notice here our h is associated with the x and our k with the y in this equation. So when I'm looking for my center here, I'm going to go ahead and look at my x value first, which is a positive 2. But remember that our equations call for a negative, so I have to take the opposite sign. So our center here would be negative 2. Our y in this case will be a positive 1, since the negative is part of the actual equations themselves. So our center here will be negative 2 and positive 1. That concludes the worksheet for 10.3. Please let me know if you have any questions.